Mr. President, they spied on the President of the United States. They used the apparatus of the U.S. government's superb intelligence gathering agencies to spy on then-candidate Donald Trump, now President of the United States. They did so in a way that was entirely predictable, entirely foreseeable, in some ways avoidable, if in fact we had the right laws on the books. We don't. That needs to change. That's why this moment, a pivotal moment, when 3 provisions of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act are about to expire, this coming Sunday, the 15th of March. We've known that this day was coming for many years. In fact, it was in 2015 when Congress last reauthorized the 3 expiring provisions on any long-term basis. The 3 expiring provisions are, of course, known as Lone Wolf, Roving Wiretaps, and 215. It is to the last of these 3 sections, 215, that I'm directing most of my remarks today. 215 is only the beginning and not the end of the portion of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, also known as FISA, that needs reform. We need reform across the board, but the expiration of 2015 gives us a unique opportunity to do that. So we reauthorized it in 2015, knowing that it would come back again for reauthorization in December of 2019. In December of 2019, we were in the middle of doing other things, so an agreement was made within this body that we would extend 215 and the other 2 provisions until this coming Sunday, March 15th. So absent action by this body between now and Sunday, March 15th, those 3 provisions of law will expire. Those 3 provisions of law should not have to expire because we ought to be able to reform FISA. A number of us have been working on this not just for days or weeks or months, but literally years. I'm now in my 10th year in the United States Senate. Basically the entire time I've been working on reforms to FISA, figuring out where its weak spots are, warning my colleagues years in advance that at some point this would be abused. We have to remember what happened with the Church Commission, the Church Committee. The Frank Church Committee a few decades ago in the United States Senate looked at the use of intelligence gathering and concluded that in every administration, basically from Wilson through Nixon, who was the president immediately before the Church Committee did its investigation and issued its report, U.S. intelligence gathering agencies had abused their authority for partisan political purposes, basically to engage in political espionage. We know that this is dangerous. We know that this is bad. We also know that this is just the beginning and not the end of the opportunities for abuse. Consider this. Given the breadth, the wide scope on the authority provided under FISA, and given the fact that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court is able to operate in secrecy and, for the most part, without any type of appellate review, any type of judicial review. These are provisions that are, in fact, vulnerable, susceptible to abuse. So it's not just the President of the United States who has reason to be concerned about this. If the President of the United States has a reason to be concerned about it, as he does, as he reminded us only just in the last few hours, issuing a statement this morning indicating that he still has concerns with FISA and that many senators are pointing out the flaws in the reform package passed by the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives earlier this week, and that many have encouraged him to veto that legislation on that basis. But if the President of the United States himself has reason to be concerned about FISA, what about the rest of Americans? This is just the episode that people know about in connection with the abuse that took place in the Carter Page investigation. Had Donald Trump not become President of the United States, we might well still not know about this particular instance of abuse. And because of the secret manner in which this law operates and the failure to provide special protections for known U.S. citizens, we all stand vulnerable. Every American citizen, whether they hold office or not, whether they're famous or not, whether they're rich or poor, regardless of their culture, their background, what part of the country they hail from. And so, Mr. President, what we're seeking here are a few modest reforms. A few modest reforms to make sure that it's a little bit harder to abuse this law. We know that human beings are flawed and fallible, and we have to rely on human beings to run governments. It'd be nice, as James Madison said, if men were angels, because as Madison wrote in Federalist 51, if men were angels, they wouldn't need a government. And if we had access to angels to run our government, we wouldn't need all these rules surrounding the extent of the power of government to protect us from the inherent risk associated with the unjust, excessive accumulation of power in the hands of the few. But alas, we are not angels, nor do we have access to angels to run our government. And so we have to rely on rules. The rules that we're proposing are not excessive. They're not extreme. They're actually very mild. Among other things, we'd like to see more robust amicus provisions, meaning provisions allowing for a third-party advocate in the FISA court to be called in under certain circumstances, especially involving a sensitive investigation, involving, for example, a political campaign or candidate, an office holder, a church, media establishment, something like that that operates with express constitutional protection. An amicus ought to be appointed to represent an absent, contrasting viewpoint, to represent American citizens, where American citizens' rights might be in jeopardy. Understanding, as we have since 2015, that these provisions would be expiring first in December of 2019, and then we reauthorized them for a short period of time to give us more time to address these amendments. I have for years been working on proposals and revisions to FISA with this specific expiration deadline in mind. I have not been, nor have any of my colleagues who have concerns about this, unreasonable or extreme in our demands. In fact, for me personally, and I won't purport to speak for anyone else in this, for me personally, I'd be fine with 2 of the 3 provisions being reauthorized without any further modification. Lone wolf and roving wiretap, let them get reauthorized, that's fine. Let's deal with 215 separately. And incidentally, Mr. President, Section 215, if Sunday comes and passes, 215 doesn't go away, it just reverts back to a previous version of 215. A previous version that still gives the government the ability to gain access to some business records associated with FISA order targets. It's just a narrower category. Now, we can argue about whether that earlier provision would be adequate or not. Incidentally, inspectors general have looked at this and concluded that the 9/11 attacks were not the fault of the inadequacy of 215. They were the result of mishandling of information that they did in fact gather, but were able to gather. In any event, I'd love to be able to have that conversation separately with regard to 215 without all 3 of these provisions being held hostage simultaneously. I've made that offer. That offer has been rejected. I also think another appropriate approach in this circumstance might well be to give ourselves a 45-day extension. 45-day extension would give us a little bit more time to deal with the coronavirus-related crises that we face right now, and then consider and debate and vote on some additional amendments, some amendments that have never had the opportunity to see the light of day. Keep in mind, this provision, getting back to the expiring provision that I have concerns with, Section 215, it existed prior to the moment when it reached its current formulation. When it existed in that formulation, it really did what the government needed it to. No one really argued that it had been inadequate. There were some people, I'm told, I wasn't in the Senate or in Congress at the time that it came to be. I'm told that among its advocates included Robert Mueller, included Jim Comey and others who just thought it would be a good idea to give the government more power. We have seen since then what happens when you give Jim Comey and Robert Mueller and other people in the government more power, and we've seen that there are some risks associated with this, not just if you're a president of the United States or a candidate for the presidency of the United States, but we know that all Americans are potentially vulnerable. And so we fast forward to earlier this week. Less than 48 hours ago, we received legislation, the legislation that was passed by the House of Representatives yesterday. That legislation was negotiated without involvement, without direct input from anybody in this body. The majority leader himself has stated publicly that he was not involved in the negotiation of that measure. That measure was passed within about 24 hours after it was introduced. It's now coming over here. Now, I'm not saying that it shouldn't be considered. In fact, I'm kind of saying the opposite of that. I'm saying I'm happy to consider it, but we need the opportunity to actually consider it. The world's greatest deliberative legislative body, or so it calls itself, the Senate, is supposed to be the cooling saucer. The cooling saucer where the hot tea spills out and is allowed to cool before it's consumed. In these circumstances in particular, where rights are at stake that are potentially threatened by provisions that under this bill introduced by Representative Nadler, supported by Representatives Schiff and Pelosi and others, have supported, hasn't had the opportunity to be independently reviewed in the Senate, or to be debated or discussed or amended in the Senate. That's all I'm asking for here. All I want is to give us a few weeks. Let's take 45 days. Give the Senate a chance to deal with the immediate crises associated with the coronavirus, and then a chance for us in a timely fashion to review the Pelosi-Nadler-Schiff bill and consider our own amendments to it. Bipartisan amendments from people who have reached across the aisle in an effort to make this bill better. And so, Mr. President, it's for those reasons that I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of the Senate bill at the desk.